Hi, my name is Jack Rackham, and today I'm going to take you for a tour of the Rockefeller family, descended from the wealthiest man of the modern era, John D. Rockefeller. We'll be exploring his mixed legacy, what happened to his enormous fortune, and what became of his children and grandchildren. Along the way, we'll be taken to some pretty interesting places, including 30 Rockefeller Plaza and the White House, and come across some unexpected people, like Carl Jung, Citizen Kane, real-life cannibals, and even, maybe, extraterrestrials. The first Rockefeller to make it to the United States was Johann Peter Rockefeller. He arrived in the country in 1723, adopting the name Rockefeller as an anglicized version of the German Rockenfelder or Rockefeller, meaning from Rockenfeld, a now abandoned village in western Germany. Step forward 3 more generations, and we have William Rockefeller Sr., the famous billionaire's father. He was something of a serial businessman, and what that business was would depend on when you asked him. He worked as a lumberman, a botanic physician with elixirs for sale, he sold horses, land, salt, you name it. But broadly, his career looked something like this. After raising cash from selling his elixirs or what have you, he focused on making land deals. He lent money to farmers who couldn't afford to pay him back in order to foreclose on them and take their farms out from under them as collateral. He even once bragged about his own children, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." And more scandal came to light shortly after he died. Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper publisher from whom we get the Pulitzer Prize, sent reporters digging into John Rockefeller's past and found out that William Sr. had, quote, treated all diseases from the same jug, magically claiming to be able to cure anyone willing to part with their money. William Sr. had 3 sons and 3 daughters. Frank Rockefeller actually had a twin sister named Frances, but she died young, and very little information survives about Lucy and Mary. So let's start with Frank Rockefeller. The youngest of the 3 boys, he was the odd man out. He had some involvement in the Rockefellers' flagship company Standard Oil, even serving as its vice president, but he fell out with his brothers and left in 1898, refusing to ever speak with them again until his death. Now the middle son, William A. Rockefeller, Jr. He joined the company that would become Standard Oil in 1867 and continued to work alongside his brother John. He also took over Anaconda Copper, a company owned in large part by the Rothschilds, and formed a holding company, that is, a company that exists solely to own another company, with the intention of controlling the copper industry, much like Standard Oil had done to the oil industry. He would eventually acquire most of his competitors, but to raise the money he needed, he came up with a pretty harebrained scheme that I can hopefully do a good job of explaining. So first of all, he purchased Anaconda Copper for $39 million, but told the new owners not to cash the check just yet. He then created a holding company called Amalgamated Copper. He then used Amalgamated Copper to buy Anaconda Copper from himself using Amalgamated Copper stock and evaluated the purchase at $75 million. Then, he listed Amalgamated Copper on the stock market and sold $75 million of stock, which he used to cover the initial purchase of Anaconda, meaning he paid for a $39 million company with money he didn't have, turned it into a $75 million company without producing anything of value, and created $36 million in cash out of thin air. William Jr. had 6 children, most notably William G. Rockefeller. This William was once predicted to be the future head of Standard Oil, but ultimately this never came to be. Still, he worked as an executive in the company, as well as a director in a gas company, copper company, textile company, and a few railroads. He had a son named James S. Rockefeller, who very much fits the image of an oil tycoon's grandson. He graduated Yale, competed as an Olympic rower, and became president of Citibank. Now we have the famous John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in modern history. He began entering into business partnerships at age 20, focused on oil. The oil industry in the United States was very young at the time. The first well in Pennsylvania was drilled in 1859, and Rockefeller's John and William had gone into the oil business in the mid-1860s, then formed Standard Oil in 1870. The primary use for oil at the time was to refine it into kerosene, a fuel used for lighting lamps, as the traditional fuel, whale oil, was becoming prohibitively expensive to many consumers. It was only later, with the popularization of the automobile, that gasoline became so incredibly lucrative. And that just as electricity was removing the need for kerosene lamps, too. Regardless, it's clear he was a savvy businessman. Standard Oil grew to enormous proportions through horizontal integration, taking advantage of economies of scale, buying out competitors, and becoming the largest operator in one stage of production, and to a lesser extent vertical integration, owning the oil wells, and the distilleries, and the pipelines, and the tank cars that deliver to local markets, and being able to sell to consumers with fewer middlemen. At one point, that single company controlled about 90% of the world's oil refining. Rockefeller began his retirement in 1902, and the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil into 34 smaller companies in 1911, some of which you're probably familiar with, like Chevron and ExxonMobil. By that time, Rockefeller held less personal control, but his net worth continued to soar. After the breakup, the company's combined net worth rose by 400% in 10 years. He left behind him a complicated legacy. He forced many people out of business and used his control of the market to make it impossible to compete with him. A strike by miners to protest deplorable working conditions at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, of which Rockefeller was a majority owner, turned into a violent massacre. Conversely, he consistently donated a significant portion of his wealth throughout his life. He and his wife Laura Spellman Rockefeller spent most of their final decades working in philanthropy, especially to promote education and medicine, notably in the case of founding the historically black women's college, Spelman College. Ultimately, the way he's portrayed and perceived is largely a function of however the presenter and the audience each feel towards capitalism. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the oil magnate's only son, and had perhaps a similar reputation. He became a director of Standard Oil in 1897, the very year he graduated from university, and he too was implicated in the Ludlow Massacre, that miners' strike I mentioned earlier. However, he received some advice from his good friend and famous Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, on how to turn his image around, and it seemed to have resonated with him. Rockefeller Plaza in New York, home to NBC Studios and namesake of the sitcom 30 Rock, is actually named after this Rockefeller, who financed its construction during the Great Depression. He was also heavily involved in philanthropy as the first president of the Rockefeller Foundation, spending hundreds of millions on charitable causes. He donated personally to rebuilding landmark buildings after the First World War and giving land to American national parks. Now, before we talk about his children, I want to quickly tell you about his siblings. Bessie Rockefeller was the eldest of John Sr.'s children. She had a dormitory named in her honor at her alma mater, Vassar College. Alta inherited the equivalent of nearly $200 million and lived in her 72-room summer home in Massachusetts, now owned by Williams College. She and her husband owned a farm on their estate where they employed several geneticists to experiment in creating more profitable farm animals. Edith married into the McCormick family, who made their fortune developing mechanized farm tools. In 1913, she traveled to Zurich to meet the psychiatrist Carl Jung, famous now for developing his theory of 16 personality types that exist along 4 different axes, for example, whether you're more extroverted or introverted. She made the trip in hopes he might be able to treat her depression, and ended up becoming fascinated by his ideas. She became a practicing psychoanalyst herself, and translated Jung's ideas into English in order to spread them in the United States. Edith divorced her husband in 1921, and he went on to marry an apparently mediocre opera singer, but he paid to give her the lead role in at least one production. This second wife of his turned out to be the inspiration for Orson Welles when creating Citizen Kane's second wife. Alrighty, John Jr. married Abby Aldrich, the daughter of a U.S. senator. Their wedding was a huge deal, the marriage of business and politics, one of the most lavish celebrations of the Gilded Age. Their eldest child, Abby, kept out of the public eye, but worked with her family's philanthropic foundation. She was a major benefactor of New York City's public-facing institutions, e.g. the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Hospital, the Museum of Modern Art, and she created a foundation to maintain and operate parks in the city. John III makes it quite easy to track who's the most senior member of the family, according to primogeniture. He's another one of those socialites who seems to appear in some pretty spectacular places, while at the same time, you can't really pin down what his actual job is. He sat on many boards of many institutions in connection with or founded by his family. He had a particular interest in East Asia and accompanied the Secretary of State John Dulles and General Douglas MacArthur to Japan in 1950 to conclude a peace treaty. And he also founded the Asia Society, a non-profit dedicated to educating the world about Asia. He had a few kids, most notably JDR IV, or J. Rockefeller, a 2-term governor and 5-term senator from West Virginia. He in turn had a son, JDR V, who goes by Jamie, and married the daughter of a former NFL commissioner. Finally, he had a son, JDR VI, who is only a child. Another Rockefeller to enter politics, Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York for 14 years, and after Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford stepped up to be president, he appointed Nelson Rockefeller as his vice. Though Nelson wasn't on the ballot in 1976, he did continue to campaign for Ford and claims to have gotten his fingers mixed up on account of his dyslexia, resulting in a photo of him flipping the bird to a group of hecklers, briefly inspiring a new euphemism, the Rockefeller gesture. His youngest son, Michael, graduated cum laude from Harvard. After graduating, he went on an expedition to study the Asmat tribe in what is today Papua New Guinea, saying he wanted to do something adventurous at a time when the frontiers of the world were disappearing. But on that expedition, he and a Dutch anthropologist found themselves stranded on an overturned boat a few miles from shore. Both swam towards the distant beach, but only his companion was rescued. It's unclear if Michael drowned or was eaten by sharks or crocodiles, but more insidious still is the possibility that he made it to shore and located the nearest village only to be killed and eaten by men, since cannibalism was still present in some areas on the island. Far less gruesome, Lawrence Rockefeller was a successful investor who lived to the ripe old age of 94. He invested in commercial aviation before it really took off post-World War II, and as if that wasn't enough, he created Venrock, a venture capital firm where he partnered with his siblings and provided venture capital for Intel and Apple, despite being at an age when most people would be hoping to retire. And just to show it's never too late to pick up a new hobby, he became intensely interested in UFOs in the 90s and pressured President Clinton to declassify the Roswell UFO incident. He didn't quite get everything he wanted, and of course the government denied that the Roswell incident had anything to do with extraterrestrials, but he did get Clinton to sign an executive order in 1994 to declassify a number of documents in the National Archives. Then in 1999, at almost 90 years of age, he funded the UK's largest study of crop circles. Winthrop Rockefeller moved to Arkansas, where he got involved in politics and became governor in 1967, the first Republican to be elected to the position since Reconstruction. His son, Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, was lieutenant governor of Arkansas for 10 years under Mike Huckabee. He announced his candidacy for governor in 2005, but resigned his campaign on account of a health condition that would soon take his life. The youngest sibling, David, was an investment banker. His father, John Jr., was at one point the largest stakeholder of Chase Bank. A single-digit percentage, but nonetheless, it was known colloquially as the Rockefeller Bank. David joined Chase while it was chaired by Abby Aldrich's brother, Winthrop, or in other words, David's uncle. 25 years later, David became CEO and chairman himself and spread the Chase brand internationally, even opening the first branch in the Soviet Union. Now, before I go, I want to answer one question that comes to mind when talking about the Rockefeller family. What happened to John D. Rockefeller's fortune? Let's say this family was a royal house, and we want to give everything to the head of the house, John IV. Exactly how much is on the table? Well, the original John D. Rockefeller was worth $1.4 billion at the time of his death, even after donating about $500 million over the course of his life. If you locked that money up and earned just enough interest to keep up with inflation, you would be sitting on a little over $27 billion today. But if you look at just how wealthy he was when compared to the US as a whole, his personal net worth was 1.5% of the entire nation's GDP. If that were true of someone today, they would have $345 billion. Now, there are a lot more Rockefellers out in the world than I've shown on this chart. Somewhere in the ballpark of 200 total descendants when you include those of William Rockefeller, who also had a significant share in Standard Oil. And, as we've seen, a lot of those descendants lived out their lives as socialites or philanthropists, often making generous personal donations on top of their work for different foundations. But a few have made some significant investments as well. Today, there are no more Rockefellers on the Fortune 500, and not everyone is making their living from a trust fund set up 5 generations ago, but their wealth is nothing to scoff at. J. Rockefeller, the West Virginia politician, has an estimated net worth around $160 million. Winthrop Paul Rockefeller, the lieutenant governor of Arkansas, was estimated around $1.2 billion with a B. Obviously, he was far removed from the family's original holdings and the successors of Standard Oil, but he was also a chief executive of his father's business and held interests in many Arkansas businesses across different sectors. And David's estimated net worth was more than twice that, at $3.3 billion at the time of his death in 2017. He was actually the last to be on the Forbes list, and it says something that his Wikipedia page has an entire section dedicated to his various residences. When you add it all up, Forbes estimated in 2016 that the family's net worth would be about $11 billion. A far cry from 1% of the United States GDP, but it's clear that the legacy of the modern world's richest man isn't fading anytime soon. Thanks for watching.